Good evening. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We're glad you could join us today. Welcome to another webinar hosted by THINK, the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation. In today's webinar, we will discuss Iran, the IRGC, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Palestinians, and global terrorism. Understanding the intricate web of Iranian-sponsored terror and its threat to Israel. Our special guests today are Dr. Eli Carmon and Professor Dr. Wolfgang Bock. Dr. Eli Carmon is a senior research scholar at the International Institute for Counterterrorism, the ICT, at the Interdisciplinary Center IDC Herzliya, Reichman University in Israel. He has written extensively on international terrorism and strategic issues of the Middle East. Professor Wolfgang Bock is a former counselor for constitutional and international law at the German Federal Academy for Security Policy, covering the Near and Middle East and Islam. He writes and teaches on constitutional law, on security law, on Islam, Islamic cultures and Islamism, and on policies and legal cultures in the MENA region. He is also a senior THINK fellow. For the new joiners, welcome. THINK stands for the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation and is a global network for international law academics, practitioners, experts in related disciplines. THINK was founded in 2017 in The Hague, the global capital of international law. And what we do is that we actually challenge the misuse of international law to delegitimize the state of Israel and advocate international law for peace and security between Israel and her neighbors. International law is a major weapon used by Israel's adversaries, and misuse of it is an existential threat to the Jewish state. We achieve our mission through research, education, and advocacy. Thank you for joining us today. Our moderator today, Andrew Drucker, Director of THINK. Welcome, Dr. Carmon. Hello, Professor Bock. Let's begin.
Thank you, Sylvia. Well, hello, everybody. Great to have you. We've got a very exciting and important topic today to deal with in a short space of time, the revolutionary regime in Tehran, which came to power in 1979. And we're going to talk about its influence in the region. And you recall a week ago, a little longer, 10 days ago, the full attack by Iran on Israel, the first open, correct me if I'm wrong, gentlemen, first open attack from Iran itself on the state of Israel, over 300 missiles and other drones and other aggressive military capabilities were thrown at Israel. Fortunately, and miraculously, perhaps, Israel managed to destroy 99% of those missiles. So it seems to me like we've entered into a new terrain here. And I'd like to start by asking you, Professor Bock, if you can just help us. First of all, let's get a bit of a grip on what is this monster of the regime in Tehran, sometimes compared with an octopus having a head with lots of tentacles.
Yes, the beginning of this awful story is 1979, 1980, when Khomeini came back from exile. In exile, he had developed a completely new form of religious dictatorship, which he had explained before in a book. And nobody had reacted, or most people hadn't read it, and the left was sometimes even full of joy about this, and they managed to make the revolution, combining even the left-wing people whom they and the women whom they later, of course, suppressed. And the main point of this new regime, it's a theocratic Islamist Shia dictatorship, but disguised as a republic. You have elections, but the elections are always ordered from above and ordered in a certain way, so that you can only elect those people whom the clergy, the Shia clergy, and of course the leader have found good. And the constitution is very clear. It says the mission of the constitution is to create conditions conducive to the development of man in accordance with the noble and universal values of Islam. The constitution provides the necessary basis for ensuring the continuation of the revolution at home and abroad. Okay, and that is already in one sentence what they are doing. They want regional hegemony in between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. That's what their imperial aim is. And so they were very clever. They wanted to destroy the states, mostly Sunni and Arab states. And of course, to do this, they had to finance and to find revolutionary groups and their proxies. So they built up Hezbollah in Lebanon since 1982, which is their firmest arm, and they act completely in accordance. They built up militias in Syria and Iraq. They built up the Houthis. They built up the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And but they had the big difficulties as they were Shia, and usually Shia and Sunni are deadly enemies in the Islamic religion since many years. And that meant they had to find a common way and a common enemy to show they are good Muslims. And the common enemy is the West. First, the United States, second, Israel, and Western values, Western conceptions of life, and so on, Western democracies. And so they try to convince the Sunni people that they are more effective than their own people. And so first, this revolution resulted in a strengthening of conservative Islam in Saudi Arabia. But soon the Sunnis saw Iran was a deadly enemy. There was a war with Iraq, and it went on all the time. They tried to destroy states to bring up their own proxies, their militias, and to get more influence. And till now, they were to a certain extent successful. But on the other side, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Emirates, Jordan, and many other Arabic states saw that Iran is their biggest enemy. Mm. And so, this project is just, and the Abraham Accords were one final signal that most of the Arab states won't go with them. Right. Anyway, there are many difficulties within the Arab states, as the long-standing propaganda against Israel is something which helps in the long run the radical Sunni or Shia politics and streamings, and therefore the governments are afraid of their own population not to go too far. Though they want to go very far, but it takes time. But you see in Saudi Arabia or in the United Arab Emirates that the culture has already changed and is changing. Okay. Thank you. To give you a final point, yes. Iran is the country which kills most of its people in relation to the number of the population, more than in China, more than in any other country. They are being killed by courts, by police, by Basiji, and so on. So they are very oppressive, and one has to guess that more than 50% of the Iranian population wants the regime to go down. That's the situation.
Thank you so much. So, Dr. Kamaran, the two things really to pick up. One is I think understanding the position of the regime within Iran itself, it's a minority, right? Within a country that has many different minority groups, Farsi and non-Farsi. But secondly, perhaps you can also help us understand the regional balance of power that's surrounding Israel, influenced by Iran, Hezbollah, Houthis, and so forth.
The strategy of the Tehran regime has been to penetrate, to destabilize Arab regimes around the region. First of all, they did it in Lebanon in 91, 92. Then in Syria with the problems that the Assad regime had after the civil war in 2011, in Iraq after the fall of the Saddam Hussein regime, and in Yemen with the coming to power of the Houthi movement, which is a kind of Shia, Zaidi specific movement, but different from the Iranian Shia. And already in 2015, the military and political leadership of Iran declared that they control 4 Arab capitals: Beirut, Damascus, Baghdad, and Sana'a, the recent member of the axis of resistance, as they call their alliance. The Palestinians are, for a long time, actually since 1992, part of this axis, especially Hamas, but also the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And also there is an attempt for many years to penetrate the Western Bank and the Palestinian Authority, to destabilize the Palestinian Authority, and lately also Jordan. I would like to describe the stakes of this conflict, because it seems to be a conflict between Israel and the Palestinians because of the brutal massacre of the Hamas on the 7th of October, the killing of so many people, and also because it was the biggest pogrom since the Second World War against the Jewish people. But at the same time, this is a regional war. The real reason for the attack on the 7th of October was to sabotage the normalization process between Saudi Arabia and Israel under the sponsorship of the Biden administration. And this was prevented at the last moment, although Iran and Saudi Arabia have signed an agreement under Chinese sponsorship. If we look to the global arena.
Sorry, Joe, just to interrupt, just to clarify for our viewers. At the time of the 7th of October attack, Israel was in a kind of negotiations with America, with Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
Were they close to reaching an Abraham Accord, do you think?
Yeah, it was already predicted that it will be signed in February or March 2024. And this was part of the global project of President Biden, which he presented at the G20 in India, which is the India, Middle East, Europe project, which has to contrast or to fight against the Belt and the Road and Belt, Xi Jinping, the Chinese president's plan, which is already in action for several years, quite successful. So this also is a sabotage of the Biden administration grandiose plan and the fight against the Chinese influence in the region. So you see how the Hamas has actually had not only its own agenda of putting the Palestinian problem on the table, but also the Iranian agenda, especially, and also the allies of the Iranians, China, and in a sense also Russia, which is involved in the war in Syria and also clearly in Ukraine.
Okay. So to what extent was the Hamas attack on the 7th of October, perhaps we need to talk about the IRGC here, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is the vehicle of the Iranian Republic for managing and stimulating and financing and sponsoring all of these relationships, as I understand it. IRGC, Hezbollah is a proxy of Iran. Hezbollah and Hamas, how closely are they related, and how much was Hezbollah helping Hamas leading up to October the 7th?
During all these years, as I said, since 1992, when the Hamas leadership was expelled to southern Lebanon, Hezbollah and Iran took control, if you want, of this leadership. And during the years, they provided all the ideological, financial, military, and practically all the support in order to build this huge machine that we discovered during the last conflict, which was quite known about the underground fortress that they built. But even the Israeli intelligence was surprised to find that this they constructed a monster, which is very difficult to defeat, and that's why this war takes already 6 months, more than the Yom Kippur War in 1973.
Okay. So, Professor Bock, where does this take us now from, if we think of the role of Iran? Is Iran and Israel now officially in a kind of war? Was the attack on Israel a declaration of war that entitles Israel to respond?
I think we were already earlier in a situation where Israel can say, as Hezbollah is completely subordinated to Iran. They won't do anything against Iran, and they usually consult. And for example, as I read before the 7th of October, there have been numerous meetings between the Al-Quds force, that's a part of the IRGC who does the foreign work, and Hamas and Hezbollah in Beirut. And they had regular meetings. There was training for the Hamas people for what they would do. And I wouldn't be surprised at all if they had not dealt with everything what should happen in this attack at the border. I'm sure that was very complicated, and I don't think they managed it on their own completely. It's rather impossible. Anyway, Iran is coordinating the attacks from Syria against Israel, and that, of course, the attacks from Hezbollah. That means they are involved in producing attacks, violent attacks on Israel that would already, and they say they want to destroy Israel, that would already allow Israel to say they are engaged in a war against us, we can retaliate. Already this, and for example, when Israel killed the generals in Syria, in Damascus, near the consulate, it was not the consulate itself, but a building next to the consulate. That was clearly a coordination of the IRGC, of the highest people in the region from the IRGC. The only aim IRGC is fighting Israel. That's the main aim, and that was, so to say, a meeting in the war against Israel. And of course, Israel had the legal right to kill these people. So you see, it is an undeclared war, or it is a declared war from the side of Iran. Iran never cares for anything from international law. What doesn't confuse us, but what should worry us, is that Iran never has been penalized for all its behavior in all these countries. And that the international, forget the United Nations, they are no longer the one who looks for international law in the questions of the Middle East. They are against Israel, and so the majority is not in favor of international law in a fair way to all states in the Middle East. And so the West should do something in favor of international law. It's a pity the West doesn't fulfill its task in this field.
Well, this is one of the dilemmas that Israel always faces, isn't it? It's Israel that normally has to take action based on intelligence that it's obviously reluctant to disclose. It acts as it did in Damascus several weeks ago, and then the whole world complains that Israel is the aggressor why is it that international law doesn't seem to be able to deal with this difficult position that Israel is in, and to recognize that Iran is the aggressive party in this whole thing?
Well, from my point of view, very short, there is one thing the West doesn't want to understand, that radical Islam, be it Sunni, be it Shia, is the deadly enemy of the West. And the West always says that's radical, those are only radical words. No, it's a program, and they act according to this program. The West doesn't want to accept this, as if it, when it, as soon as they see it is true, they have to do much more than they did before. And that produces problems with Islam, with Muslims, and so on. And they don't want to deal with all these problems. But they should, and they have to. The longer they throw it away, the harder it will come back.
Right. So, Dr.
my
Kaman,
answer
what's
would
your
be-
response to this? Yeah.
My answer would be more prosaic. Most of the states, including United States, the great United States, are afraid of Iran. If you remember, the President Reagan's retreat from Lebanon in 1983, after two bombings of the American embassy, the destruction of the Marines camp and the French paratroopers troops by bombings of the Hezbollah with the Iranian and Syrian support, the Western forces retreated. For 10 years, almost most of the kidnapped people, Western kidnapped people, were not liberated. And this is the same with the Argentinian government, which did not respond to the bombings of the Israeli embassy and the Jewish building AMIA in 92-94. This is true for India, which was twice attacked in the last 10 years, or Thailand, which did not respond to the terrorism of Iran because they are blackmailed. Including, we saw what happened in Belgium, that liberated the head of the network, intelligence network, which was arrested after an attempted attack in France. And the Belgian parliament changed the law in order to permit the liberation of this officer, intelligence officer, and in exchange for one Belgian head worker, which was arrested for so-called for espionage in Iran. And this is a blackmail strategy that we see since the beginning of the regime, by the way.
How does that work? How does this...
Kidnapping of the diplomats for 440 days of kidnapping of American diplomats without response.
And how does that blackmail work? Is it a fear of Iranian reprisal, a fear that Iran will use more violence?
Yeah.
Is there money involved? Is it got to do with the sanctions?
Clearly, but also sometimes they give, I would say, some presents to some countries. For instance, for the case of India, although they attacked their territory in attacking the Israeli embassy in 2012, they promised to give them more rights for oil fields in Iranian territory. Okay, this is one of the cases. And in Argentina, there was a lot of corruption with the Kirchner government at the time. So this is how it works. And it seems that it works well because they are the only time they were, by the way, the regime was deterred was after what is called the Mykonos trial in Berlin, when they killed 4 opposition members of the Kurdish party, and the high-level tribunal in court in Karlsruhe decided that the leaders of Iran are responsible, personally responsible. For 15 years, they didn't touch the European territory. Since 2017-18, they returned because they see there is no real response to their terrorist attacks.
So what could and should the West do?
Well, you see 2 strategies in the United States, for example. One strategy was the one followed by Obama and Biden, appeasement, and in question of the nuclear bomb, I think what the agreement really served only the aim to postpone the dangers, but they gave Iran so much money. under Biden at least 60 to 80 billions of dollars since Biden came in, and under Obama it was quite a lot as well. It was very much as well. And the other strategy was the Republican strategy under Trump to divert their income from oil, not to pay anything as ransom, and so on. And I think this was the better strategy. But the best strategy would be, they were afraid of Trump. As long as Trump was president, no US ship was attacked by Iran. Since Biden came in, till today, about 170 attacks and no answers. And take, for example, the Houthis, what would be really a not so difficult military task to stop them doing what they are doing. Well, the answers are very bad and very only defensive. And Iran has built up an offensive force everywhere with rockets and so on. And you can't go in the long run against an offensive power only with defensive measures. You pay and pay and pay. They pay much less, and in the end, they attack you with an overwhelming mass of rockets and missiles and so on. So you have to do something against it, and that's what the West doesn't want to do at the moment. So it's a question of military might and to show power. And the Iranians are, if you show them power, for example, Soleimani, when he was killed, they didn't kill the people they said they would kill, because of course they tried, but they didn't succeed. But anyway, so Iran knows its limits as well, and the West should go another way than to say we'll have a solution by appeasement and by diplomatic steps. They don't work, and the Iranians want these diplomatic steps and nothing more.
At the G7 this week, I think they announced increased sanctions, call for the IRGC to be placed on the EU terror list. Are these helpful moves? Do you think Europe is responding strongly enough?
I hope so. I hope so, because I'll give you the example of the JCPOA, the agreement of President Obama with the Iranians. He was very hopeful that this will change the moderate with the regime, and it was exactly the contrary. The radicals were empowered and took the control of the parliament and later of the presidency. But on the sidelines of this agreement, there was a list of 800 personalities and companies, Iranian personalities, which were involved in terrorist activity. At the same time, they were involved in nuclear activity. And all these people were taken out of this list, including, by the way, General Qasem Soleimani and other leaders of the IRGC, which deal directly with terrorism against the United States. So they continue to prepare for the construction of the project. I don't say that Trump's decision to cancel the agreement was a big victory, because he did nothing else besides some sanctions. But still, I mean, the agreement gave the possibility to the Iranians to have a respite for several years, and did not arrest or did not stop the expansion, the colonial expansion of the Quds force in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq especially, and lately in Yemen.
And to bring it into one point, the West should do nothing to help this regime to survive. That's the point. It's the decisive point. And the West is not taking this way till today.
What are the okay? So what are the alternatives in Iran? Are there opposition groups who would be? I mean, how do you get rid of a regime, and how can the West contribute to having this regime brought down?
For the last 20-25 years, there were several waves of huge protests. There was in 1999 a huge wave of student protests. thousands were arrested, several thousands were killed, by the way, and it stopped. Then there was the regime of the moderate President Khatami. But during the so-called reforms regime, the internal minister of interior and the mayor of Tehran, which considered to be too moderate, were arrested by the intelligence apparatus, which also killed several of the authors and writers and journalists, which are considered to be too liberals. And then you have even the last year, the huge wave of women, young women, which wanted liberation from the religious constraints. And they didn't have, by the way, it was expression of what is you presented at the beginning. 55% of the population in Iran are Persians, but there are a lot of Sunnis. There are the Kurds, the Baluchis, the Arabs, and even the Azeris in the north, which are Shias, but many of them consider themselves to be colonized and want to be independent. So I think that only a kind of coalition between the middle class, which, by the way, was a bit influenced by what they saw in Iraq and Syria. I mean, the fact that the wave of what was called the Arab Spring in Syria and Iraq led finally to a lot of chaos and the rise of ISIS or Daesh. So they are very deterred to fight violently against the regime. But if there is a coalition between the minorities and this middle class, I think this is the only solution. And clearly that will be a very difficult fight, as you see today, or the last 10 years, in the civil war in Syria, where you have a minority of Shia Alawis with the support of Iran and the Hezbollah fighting the majority of the Sunnis. And still, Syria is still in war. It's only controlling 60–70% of its territory. You have the Kurdish enclave, you have the jihadist enclave, and so on. So the regime is so aware of the threats against internal threats that it's very violent against any opposition. And we heard that the last weeks there are lots of arrests and even killing of young people because the attempts of demonstration in the streets.
So it seems to me one of the most important things is a better understanding of the regional impact that Iran is having and the threat on Israel's borders in Lebanon. Also Jordan, I understand Hezbollah is very active. The regime in Jordan is afraid of unrest. Hezbollah providing arms and munitions to groups along the border with Israel. Can you tell us a little bit about where this is at? Where is the conflict at the moment on the northern border of Israel with Lebanon?
Israel is a very difficult position, a strategic one, because it is not defeat the Hamas in a short period of time. We are still preparing an offensive in the last stronghold in Rafah, and this is a huge international problem with the relations between the Americans on the one hand and the Egyptians. And just this evening, our chief of staff and the head of the security service of the Shabak are in Cairo in order to coordinate the continuation of the pressure, military pressure in Rafah. And if they achieve an agreement with the Egyptians, it will give the possibility to isolate part of the population, which is there, at least 1 million, to move them in a more secure terrain, secure position, and then to try to destroy the last stronghold and the 4 or 5 battalions that are still in this region. The problem of Rafah is that this is the border with Egypt and the possibility of smuggling, not only smuggling weapons like they did for all these years, but also the hostages. We are afraid that they will take some of the hostages and pass them to the Sinai or even beyond. So this is the last, I would say, attempt, but also there is a problem of who will control Gaza. And here we have the problem of our internal situation where the prime minister is not ready to accept the intervention of a Palestinian Authority, I would say, moderated or changed Palestinian Authority, not the Abu Mazen leadership, which is no more considered to be legitimate, but to find the leaders that will take control of the Gaza Strip, take control from Hamas, and destroy the military and bureaucratic power of Hamas. By the way, most of the people of Fatah are in prison. Until today, many of them were arrested in 2007 during the military coup. Some of them, hundreds, were thrown from big buildings, which, in my opinion, already then showed that Hamas is like ISIS, like Daesh. They have the same. At that time, because it was against their brethren, the Palestinians, nobody protested. Even the Palestinian Authority was quite blind, mild in their attack, I mean, Abu Mazen. But they are the only ones, I think, which have the knowledge. They live there, they controlled Gaza before the military coup. They could, together with the international community, especially Egypt and the Gulf countries, reconstruct Gaza and permit some kind of new life to the Gazawis.
Well, to take up your question for the North, Andrew, starting with the 7th or 8th of October, Hezbollah began shooting rockets, missiles, and everything, many things, and therefore more than 100,000 people had to leave the north of Israel. That means a big part of the northern Israel has been depopulated by shootings from by the mass shootings from Hezbollah. Of course, that's a war, nothing else than war. That means Israel retaliates. Till the moment they only retaliate, they retaliate very effectively. They have killed most of the Hamas commanders within a distance of 20 to 30 kilometers into South Lebanon, and they are hiding now. They don't work in the open any longer as they are afraid. The rest, more than half of them shall have been killed, as I read. So there is a kind of war. The big question is, as Hezbollah has more than 100,000 rockets, and they are very precise, and they can overwhelm the defense of Israel. One has to be afraid. And so, if there is a really war-like confrontation, Israel has to take out at once most of these rockets, and that will be a huge destruction only from destroying these rockets, and mentioning really nothing else. So that's the situation in the north. And why doesn't the international community and the West react to this? They should say they make war, they are terrorists. Stop them. And the question of the Palestinian Authority is still in the open. When I visited the government there in a German diplomatic mission, we had some people who said we never want to become like IS, and that meant we never want to become like Hamas, and that meant we don't want war with Israel. But of course, they won't say it open and loudly. Because if they say this, many of their own people will want to kill somebody who says this. So maybe there are some good people within the PA, but at the moment the PA is radicalizing the population for the fight against Israel all the time. And so it's very difficult to say if the PA can play a role. I would say at the moment, no. The culture of the PA is against this. But who knows how this changes if Hamas has been defeated, and if the most of the Arab states say you can't go on this way, will they go completely over into the camp of Iran? I'm not sure if they want to do this as a PA. But that's a question of development, and Europe should do something about this and tell the PA we won't give you the money for the people who have killed Israelis as long as you pay the families of the murders. And that's what the PA does. Even the Hamas people and families get money from the PA for killing Israelis. So the Hamas people who are imprisoned now, they get money from the PA because they are imprisoned by the Israelis. That's what the EU finances indirectly, and the EU should stop this at once. So the West can do quite a lot. They don't do it at the moment.
So what do you think of these calls for Palestinian statehood? A lot of countries are thinking of recognizing Palestine as a state. Palestine's arguing in the International Court of Justice that Israel should withdraw from the territories. They should be recognized as a state.
Personally, I think that the only solution, political solution to the conflict with the Palestinians is a two-state solution. Because otherwise, with one-state solution, we'll have a worse situation than Syria today or Sudan, what you see in Sudan. I mean, the two communities cannot survive together if we occupy, like the right-wing extremists here in our country want to occupy practically all of the West Bank. And you see even the two ministers, the right-wing ministers, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir in our government, which even speak about recolonizing Gaza Strip. But it is a long process because the Palestinians, the Abu Mazen regime has been inefficient, corrupted, and also because I would say the two sides did not, especially the last government, the last 10 years, did not negotiate in faith, in good faith. I think that now there is a possibility because Gaza is very important, even economically. Gaza has important gas oil fields which can help the reconstruction. The Gulf countries want to invest a lot in Gaza Strip. So if there will be reformed Palestinian Authority, supported by the international community, especially by the Sunni moderate countries, this can change the done. It's a question also of education. It will not be immediately. I don't believe in a Palestinian state in 6 months or 1 year. But if you begin the negotiations, if you make arrangements that permit the reconstruction, permit the well-being of the people in Gaza, which have suffered, clearly have suffered under the Israeli attacks, this can give hope and also prove to the Israelis there is some possibility, because you must understand that the attack of 7th of October has changed the public opinion. Even the most leftist people in Israel now write this because they saw what the Arabs, the Palestinians, were ready to do them. It was not a war. It was a massacre. It was violation of women. It was burning of children. So this was a huge psychological impact on the population, and that's why it's so difficult to convince the people to accept resolution of the conflict, even if it's much later, in cooperation with the Palestinian Authority.
Okay, Wolfgang, you can remark on this, and then we're going to go to the Q&A.
Yeah. I have a small but. A two-state solution depends, in my opinion, from a total change in the Palestinian culture. At the moment, 80%, even in the West Bank, say that was wonderful what happened on the 7th of October. Between 70 and more than 80%, as well as in Gaza. This radicalized culture, which is nearly, or which you may compare to the National Socialist culture with Jew hatred and Israel hate and so on, this culture has to be changed. Otherwise, a state will only be the next step to fighting Israel with better possibilities. And so everything depends on this change in the Palestinian culture. And as the education, politics, schools, newspapers, kindergarten, where they are being taught how to kill Israelis and to be a hero and so on. It is worse than in National Socialism what they are doing there. The National Socialists would have been proud. Hitler would have been proud if he had seen what the Palestinians are doing in their schools. So that's the situation. And the West has to change this. No money if this continues. Only money if you change your culture. And that means, of course, that's not only a small reform, that's a breaking development which has to be brought on the way. And as long as this doesn't happen, no state will be able to be instituted, because the Israelis will say no. The majority of the people of Israel will say no. Without a peaceful culture, amongst the Palestinians, no state for the Palestinians. And that's the decisive point from my point of view.
Well, there's a problem here, isn't there? That if we speak about the West, if you look at the United Nations, the West is a minority within the United Nations. So they can't even coordinate themselves to create a coalition within the United Nations structure to impose these requirements and conditions upon Palestinians. They have Europe holds the key in terms of financing, but politically, how is the West able to require the Palestinians to reform themselves?
Well, the first step, for example, regarding the UNRWA, you have the Human Rights Committee, which is being presided by the worst human rights killers of all states. Iran and other people are in there, and the Women's Committee is the same. So no money for these committees, no money for all these institutions who produce hate on Israel and on the West. We finance the United Nations. Why shouldn't China finance the United Nations as they want it as an appendix of their own policy?
Yeah.
And we should, if that happens, we should say no, no, no. So in the long run, more countries will come to the side of the West. And that's what we have to organize. It's a long run, a very long run. And the United Nations is in a catastrophic situation regarding international law and the Middle East and Ukraine and so on. Yeah. So, okay, we have to go on and to begin with this task. And that's what the West has to be convinced of. At the moment, there's much work to do, nothing more.
Okay, well, Sylvia, I'm going to hand to you Q&A. We might even start with tackling UNRWA. I see there is a question about UNRWA. They're being one of the main institutions that's perhaps problematic in this field.
Yeah, indeed. So the question is, what about getting rid of UNRWA with its eternal refugee challenges and its hate education and training, de facto controlled by Hamas and hence Iran?
Yeah, it's known for many years that UNRWA was penetrated by Hamas, and it's quite natural because Hamas controls everything in Gaza Strip. There is no opposition. As I said, Fatah movement was completely destroyed. Most of their leaders are still in jail. When after the revolution of President Sisi, the Tehran, I think, movement brought to power in Egypt, General Sisi, instead of the Muslim brother Morsi, President Morsi, the same movement or the same kind of movement appeared in Gaza. In several weeks, it was completely annihilated by the Hamas. So all the leadership and even the hospitals, we know, the medical establishment was penetrated by Hamas. They dominated the main leaders, directors, and therefore nothing has changed in the education of the people that received the money for their schools. They did close the eyes when all the schools were used as human shields with a lot of underground missile and rocket preparations. And therefore, I think, by the way, it's again a unique kind of organization. For 70 million people, 70 million refugees in the world, you have one international United Nations body. But for the Palestinians, for so many years, 75 years, you have the UNRWA, which serves the Palestinians everywhere and keeps going all this kind of, if you want, of hatred and education for return and for destruction of the of Israel, because they are not acting only in Gaza, they are acting in the West Bank, in the camps in Lebanon, in Syria, where, by the way, they are not accepted as free citizens. The millions of people that lived for years in Lebanon or in Syria, they cannot work, they cannot have rights. The only survival is through the UNRWA. And UNRWA is a kind of a tool by the extremists to continue to indoctrinate and to radicalize the young Palestinians.
UNRWA has to be neutralized and to be transformed or to be dissolved, and there must be a neutral organization. At the moment, it is not possible, so don't give UNRWA $1, €1, as long as they promote terrorism, and even amongst themselves. So you have to control everything there. And the latest declaration and analysis of UNRWA is very, very politicized and aim-driven, where the results of this analysis are not convincing.
So,
I mean,
Professor,
what the UN tried to do to bring UNRWA into the sphere where they are not attacked. They try to do this because they know UNRWA is in a very bad situation, and the West should react to this, and no money for UNRWA as long as it promotes terrorism, and this has to be controlled by neutral people, not by people sorted out by France or by the General of the United Nations. Gutierrez.
thank you. Yes, and to continue on this point, Professor Box, your point on de-radicalizing Palestinians. How can we do this when many non-state actors and Arab Muslim states will continue to feed the hate and destructive ideology of Islamism? And Barry Malmern here is asking, I'm not referring to the UN here. The UN is harmful to stability in this case, in my opinion, even if reformed.
The only possibility to go first steps in this way, from my point of view, is take the Saudis, take the states of the Abraham Accords, and try to find out how to educate the Palestinians in another way. And that means you have to bring freedom to the Palestinians. At the moment, every Palestinian, there are only between 10 and 20% who want peace with Israel, not more. But everybody who says this will be killed or will be brought into prison. So you have first to guarantee freedom of discussion and freedom of culture for the Palestinians, and that is very difficult to do. But I think there are ways, but you have to discuss them with other countries as well, and their Arab brethren, they should be engaged in this as well. Otherwise, the Israelis alone, I don't think they can do it.
We see it, by the way, in the Arab countries which signed the Abraham Accords, especially the Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco. These countries have been much more open to accept the Israelis in their countries, and also they are received as equal citizens, not as enemies. And therefore, I think if with time the Palestinians will join this effort, Arab moderate effort, then this kind of culture and education will advance and will permit, I would say, the change of mentality. There is a huge need of change of mentality. By the way, also some change also in the Israeli mentality, not only the Palestinian mentality. I was several years ago in Morocco, visiting Morocco, and I was amazed how many Moroccans told me, we are very unhappy that the Jews left Morocco. Okay, so they understood that there is no need of enmity between the two peoples, and since the last agreements, there was a huge influx of tourists and the exchange of cultural exchanges between Israel and Morocco, which, by the way, is the chairman of the Jerusalem Pan-Arab Jerusalem Committee.
So I'm very happy to see that we have many questions coming in, a lot about the Palestinian state and many about Iran. But since I will start with Iran, if I may, Dr. Khamon, what are Iran's vulnerabilities today? Could attempts be made to support Iran's internal dissent? Could it be a good strategy to overthrow the regime?
If we speak about the international community, I think that the West and especially the United States have not been sufficiently challenging the Tehran regime, especially on the issue of human rights. As I explained at the beginning, there were several waves of protests which were clearly destroyed by force and by a lot of blood of the Iranian population. And therefore, I think the international community, especially Europeans and United States, but also I think countries like India, like Australia, could press much more in order to have a liberalization in Iran and support also the Iranian opposition abroad. Ironically, we see today that most of the Iranians, or many Iranians inside Iran, and clearly the opposition against Iran outside Iran, are supporting Israel, much more than some students of Anglo-Saxon origin, or I would say Dutch or Italian origin, okay, which are supporting the Palestinians. Because the Iranians understand, the Iranian people understand that this is a regime of religious dictatorship. And they suffered for so many years, since 1979, and they understand that Israel is not an enemy. I was at conferences where Iranians behind the scenes said we should be allies like in the past, okay? Because clearly it's not the Iranian people, it's the Iranian regime, which leads this kind of anti-Israeli mentality at all the international forums, to present Israel as to be a country to be destroyed. I don't understand how the international community really, especially the United Nations, is accepting even this kind of discourse at the September, October sessions of the General Assembly.
Thank you.
I think the West is in a huge crisis. Looking at the elites in the United States, you can see that what happens at the universities, at the elite universities of the Ivy League, has been supported by at least 1/3 of the Democratic Party since long. And Obama did it as well. So there's a coalition between Marxist, red colored people and green, very conservative Islamist people. And they think they make a revolution and are anti-imperialist and post-colonialist. This is a big crisis in the West. And as long as the West doesn't tackle this point, all the other illusions which have been brought in politics by appeasing Iran, by appeasing Qatar, and so on, will survive. So we have to change the political self-consciousness of the West to understand the big dangers which come out of the Middle East, for example, from Qatar, not to mention Iran, and not to mention Turkey, who is under Erdogan on the whole on the way to Muslim Brotherhood policies all the time. And the West doesn't want to understand it because it makes difficulties. But we have to deal with these difficulties, and we shouldn't give up our own identity, our democracy, human rights, and so on, in dealing with these regimes. And for example, from the question of the United States would be, why should we give Qatar all the millions for this huge United States army flight and concentration there, which is being financed all the time by the United States? Why don't they go into a state which is much more favorable to the West? Why do they stay in Qatar? And the same goes for many European governments and so on. So you see, it's really a very deep going political change we need in the West as well, for this danger coming out of the elites from the left, filled with Israel hate and anti-Semitism, has been growing since the 90s at least. And so we have generations of people who went into the institutions and taught all this to the students. The students don't develop it from themselves. They get it being taught. They are being taught by the professors from the Ivy League. And we have similar situations in other countries, not as bad, but similar. And all these points have to be looked upon from a new perspective. And so we need a deep going change in Western policies and Western self-consciousness. And the best, I think there's one sentence which brings it into, in short, at one point: the Jews are the canaries in the coal mine, and every culture which propagates hate of Israel, hate of Jews, shows they are against the West. So the West should look at this point. Israel is often something which you have to look at to see, and to look in the Middle East to see where are the dangers for the West. That would be a good intellectual task to look what task we have to fulfill in the long run.
The left-wing and radical left-wing groups and movements don't understand how dangerous is the Iranian regime. I lectured in several South American universities in Chile, in Argentina, in Brazil, and you see the admiration they have for the Iranian regime. And they don't know how the Iranian regime is fighting against any liberal or any trade union, for instance, any leftist organization in this country. They are simply going to prison after the first declarations or first publications. I published at the time an article showing, in a Brazilian review, showing how retrograde, how conservative, and how dangerous it is for the left-wing groups. They don't know that in 1982, the Ayatollahs killed in prison 4,000 members of the Communist Party, which were their allies for 3 years, 79, 82. They were allies to take control. And then they simply assassinated in prison 400 members of the today Communist Party. And by the way, Soviet Russia at that time did not react.
So I will continue with we will finish in 5 minutes, but one of the questions here was related to, I lost it for a second, by Peter. It started with a comment that said, "It seems to me that the West misunderstands the culture of the Middle East. The West projects its own ideas of liberal democracy on the Middle East. However, what matters in the Middle East is power and money. So appeasement will not work. The entire region will laugh at the EU." What do you think?
I think that's a correct analysis. And the biggest problem in understanding the Middle East is that you have a culture of families, of clans, and of power. And the power comes from the basis, but from the families in most of these countries. That's not the case so much with Iran. That's another structure there. But in many of these countries, you have this culture and you have a religious culture, which is entirely different from the Western culture. And if you don't want to understand these differences, you won't be able to know what happens. One short example. The one minister in the coalition government of Hamas and PLO, which only worked for a short time, was a Christian who had friends in Jerusalem. And a journalist wrote with his knowing him, wrote an opinion piece on this, and they showed he was friendly to Israel. Then came a phone call from Jerusalem of an old friend of him, and he said, "If you work in this government, we can't do any more business." So he went away. He said, "I won't be minister any longer." The next person to do this job was from his family, an uncle or somebody else from this family who was Christian as well. So you see, power comes through family and has to adopt with the political structures. That's something which is completely different from Western societies. And the religious question, I can't delve into it very deep, but these are all cultural moments which the West usually doesn't want to understand. Only if you understand this, you'll be able to understand why democracy is not the solution for a radicalized Palestinian population at the moment. If you let them vote, they will vote for Hamas at the moment. So that's the big difficulty, and that's difficult to understand for somebody from the West who has quite another perspective on civilization and culture.
Thank you. Since I think we deal mainly with international law, so I will ask a question about international law to finalize, and then would like to hear final comments before finishing the webinar. So maybe Andrew, you can assist in this question as well as, what is the legal framework in international law for the morally understandable practice of executing key players of Iranian terrorist organizations in countries like Syria, which are not directly at war with Israel?
So the question is, Israel allowed to eliminate? Well, in principle, there's no reason why not. There are certain things you can't do, but it's a war. So wherever these people are, Israel is provided it's not violating the sovereignty of another nation. I would say, every country has an obligation even under the International Convention on the Prevention of Terrorism to prevent terror happening. Not only to respond to terror, but to respond to the terror and the financing of terror. So that means I'm not advocating going around killing people all around the world, but there are things which governments should and could be doing to be preventing terror. So that is my understanding of what happened in Damascus several weeks ago. Dr. Kamen, correct me if I'm wrong, but the reason that Israel is alleged to have carried out this operation, as Professor Bock said, was not in, but next to the consulate the Iranian consulate in Damascus, was a legitimate exercise of Israelis' right to self-defense.
I think the Iranians did so many things against Israel that this was a right response. By the way, I think that for many years that we should attack Tehran and not destroy Beirut or even Damascus, because they are responsible for what happens. The problem is that for the first time, using the pretext that the building which was attacked, which actually was the general staff of the Quds force, 7 of the highest officers of this force, which is controlling what happens in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, were there. And the fact that they said this is the Iranian consulate, this is an attack against our territory. Theoretically, it's true. But first of all, the Iranians are attacking all the time, including attacking our embassies for so many years with explosions, not with kind of protests. But at the same time, there is information that the building was not exactly the consulate, but there was a special building built between the consulate and the embassy in order to permit the leadership, the military leadership of our Quds force to meet regularly there and prepare their plans of attack against Israel.
Professor Bock, what's your perspective?
Yes, I agree completely. So let me still bring a thought on how could the policy and the opinions in the West be changed. I think you have to follow the money. Show what the money of the West in reality does. Show why we shouldn't give money to Iran, to UNRWA, and so on, and go along the money paying murders and so on, paying weapons, paying the oil from Iran. If Iran can't sell oil to China, the production of drones for Russia will collapse soon. So so go in this direction, and you need this intellectual, political change of minds within the West. And so we have to work for this as well. And it's a long change which has to be brought, and it won't happen within 1 year. It will take us at least 5 to 10 years. But you know, when communism was at its height, that was, I think, after the defeat of National Socialism, the West had a similar task, a very difficult task at that time. And they made wrong decisions and so on. And we won't go in everything the correct ways, but we need this change. We need an intellectual spring of the West, a new spring, which doesn't bring democracy to the whole world, but which helps people to develop themselves, that they become more cultivated, civilized in their own way. And that's not being against Islam. That's not being against governments in the Middle East, but it's for finding the ways to bring some kind of development and better development to these countries. And therefore, we must change our policy completely, as we see the bad results. The 7th October is a result of a mal-constructed foreign policy of the West over more than 20, 30 years. As well, it's not the only. The West is not the West didn't do it, but the West didn't prevent it, and they could have prevented much more.
Well, I think that's a great way to finish, and it's a kickoff of a lot more events, I think, and a process of developing and exploring, because it's new terrain, as you say, I think, Professor Bock, and we have to develop a new way of thinking. Thank you both so much for helping us this evening.
Thank you for having me. And,
Thank you as well.
see you in continuation.
Let's hope so. Yes, for sure.
Indeed.
All the best.
Sylvia.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night. Thank you for joining us. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact us directly through our website. See you at the next webinar.
Thank you for organizing everything. Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Dr. Carmon. Thank you, Andrew. Have a good night.